literally every story in the news is economics. But that does present some challenges for us. And it's a challenge that I quite struggle with getting the balance right. And I was really, really pleased when Andrew wrote a blog post basically extolling the same problem. Andrew, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, hello. Everyone hear me all right?
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got just a few notes on a PowerPoint, so I'll share that. I started a blog last week because, got lots of spare time. And the first thing I wrote about was topicality, as Isabel said. But first of all, I thought the reason I started writing something is that there's clearly lots of economics teachers on Twitter. There's lots of sharing of content, and there's tutor to you and stuff, and there's all that sort of stuff, and it's great. But I also follow a lot of people in the sort of like the edu Twitter sphere, all the sort of big names like Tom Bennett and Daisy Christodoulou and all those sort of people. And I just sort of thought there was surprisingly little sort of interaction and overlap between those two groups. And I think some of that is obviously because there's fewer of us. For every one of us, there's probably like 5 humanities teachers that are talking about things. But it sort of struck me that maybe there isn't quite as much discussion about teaching economics and something business, I suppose, as well, as some other subjects are doing. And I saw today just some historians talking about the nature of history as a subject and the nature of knowledge in that subject, and they're having some really intellectual chats over Twitter and sharing some things. And I just thought we're not quite doing that. I know there's some things that are doing that a little bit, but I just sort of thought there's possibly a gap in the market there. And so the first thing I spoke about was this issue of topicality, that I think at the very least there's a little bit of a trade-off, in that we have this subject which is by its nature extremely topical, extremely current, and we even, I'm sure you all do, sort of sell it on that basis, that you say, look how economics explains the world. And that is at least partially in conflict, I think, with the idea of a sort of settled core curriculum and the questions over what we want students to learn. And I think that's true even within the confines of an A-level. And it's really important to make sort of abstract ideas concrete and to do application. But I was trying to raise some interesting questions about sort of how we really use application and topical issues. And so the sort of main points of what I said was that I think is actually something more difficult to use than I perhaps thought, say, 10 years ago. Especially with regard to what's become obviously quite a trendy thing in education circles in the last sort of 5 years, about the sort of difference really between novice learners and experts. And I think if I look back in retrospect, I was chucking stuff at students that really they weren't actually capable of quite understanding to begin with. So I've moved away a little bit from it over time, and I've been trying to think about how best to introduce sort of topical issues. That's probably where we'll have the discussion around, I guess. But I think those issues then tap into some wider things of, I suppose, the nature of economics as a subject in a way. So here are some of the things I was thinking about, that I think it's getting harder because economics just sort of keeps accumulating, and I think sort of maybe, I don't know, the time periods that we exist in maybe are stretching out, that we've got this new crisis, but it's clearly still in the shadow of a long period of low productivity and the financial crisis and the hangover from that. And it's sort of like you have to keep going backwards more to explain the sort of issues that we're dealing with now, or at least at a detailed level. Don't think the challenge in this particular area is insurmountable, but I think behavioral economics gives us an example of something where new things just sort of add, but they don't really necessarily replace. So behavioral economics remains a sort of add-on and a critique, and we don't really have maybe an agreed, settled thing to offer the students. We have a sort of core original thing, and and here's these sort of slight flaws within it. It's, I don't know, if you look at the questions that we ask, or the questions the exams ask about it, they're a little bit sort of tacked on and superficial, I think. And then of course that goes to much bigger things about curriculum in general, about assessment, about maybe the exams encourage some rather superficial understandings of some things. And I'm sure we've all had plenty of students who have really grasped it all really very well, and they go on to Oxbridge and all sorts. But the wider range of students, I'm not sure necessarily always really cope that well with all this stuff that we might chuck at them. And that goes to the fundamental question of sort of education, of what actually do we want students to understand. And I think possibly, I'm starting to think that even within the confines of an A-level, we've got choices about what it is we want to present and what sort of narratives we want to suggest. And given the subject is never settled, we struggle with that, I think, sometimes, and we take shortcuts and we maybe strip things down, and we end up with what can be sort of superficial for a lot of the students, really excellent stuff for maybe the top end, but a difficult and complicated set of ideas for maybe some students at the lower end of the spectrum. And so that's the sort of stuff I've been thinking about. I've got no great answers, I've got no sort of claims to have a solution to any of this, but that's the sort of things I've been contemplating. So I'll stop sharing there.
So a lot of questions there, really, and it comes down to some big, almost existential points on what are we as economists. What if we have economics without kind of application in current affairs and topicality, then it's really just this made up set of theories, which is much easier to teach, but it doesn't actually mean anything. I guess it just becomes some kind of academic exercise. Manisha, you suggested to start with application. Do you want to elaborate on that at all, or?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I do a couple of things actually. I spent a lot of time in the last couple of years looking at flipped learning and how to do it, mainly because I had a bit of a rubbish timetable split. But now what I do is, and I use the core Econ textbook as well to help do it, because it's free online and I can just send the links because we're setting all of our homeworks through Grove Schools. So I'm using that, getting them to look at the application before they come in, and then what we're then doing is we're starting with the application and then starting to think about what economic issues can then link to what economic issues are linking to what they've then potentially read, seen, watched, etc. Which I found helps them to understand it a lot better and a lot easier, to be fair. I think that's it.
And does anyone have any ways that if you're giving students reading to do or news to watch or whatever, has anyone got any tips for helping students to actually understand that? Because news generally, whatever's in the news, actually COVID-19 is a bit different because you can almost follow it from start to finish. Obviously there's lots of background factors about the NHS and inequality and things like that, but a lot of the stories in the news have very, very detailed histories that students can't necessarily pick up. You can't pick up a newspaper one day and completely understand what that is. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? And also, sorry, Prerna, I know that you've just been sitting there with your hand.
I wasn't sure if you could see me.
I can. Right. So we'll go to Prerna first. Go on.
I think what really helps is you have to make it quite explicit sometimes if you're talking about something that's topical or in the news, exactly where it fits in. Now, even COVID-19, it is, well, it's a demand and supply side shock all in one go, and a huge one, but that is what it is. And, in the same way that the great financial crash was about, the impact of drying up of credit, on global economies. I think that really helps, because otherwise they make the topic the thing, as opposed to linking it back to support some theory, which I think somebody said before. So I think you have to make it, whenever you're presenting a news story, or whenever we talk about COVID-19 in the future, exactly where, if we're talking about it being a demand side shock, for example, exactly where, what part of aggregate demand is being affected by the specific example that you're talking about. Or if it's a supply side shock, why and how is it a supply side shock? Because otherwise they like to talk about things that are in the news, but it doesn't fit in anywhere. It needs to kind of have schema, it needs to link into some knowledge somewhere. So I think I find I have to make that quite explicit, especially for kind of, students whose knowledge isn't quite secure. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult with the flow there. If we go to Nicola first, and then we'll go to Sarah. Sorry, I can see that you've raised your hand, Sarah. But let's go to Nicola first. She's just working out how to unmute herself. It's okay. Can you find it? Normally in the bottom left. There we go.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. Following on from Primer, I get what she's saying, because it's really hard to avoid what I call the social science, general sciences answer, and actually it just becomes a more general discussion. Kind of two things I do here is, obviously I run the masterclasses and do things like the gold standards, Bretton Woods, and that puts the history into things. Don't really start doing those until upper sixth, because of that kind of novice learners idea. I teach to a cohort who have come from a variety of backgrounds and often have issues with even understanding general tier 2 academic language rather than just the tier 3 key terms. So they can't often access a piece of wider reading because there's not the general understanding in terms of academic writing. So I've introduced very much at the beginning of lower six, where they're given a piece, at first they're given a piece of wider reading, and they have to change academic language into their speaking language, the words they would normally use. And then as we move on, they then do the opposite. They have to make a piece of writing more academic and change the audience for it. And we do that to start. Obviously then we found that over time, then they begin to, if anybody has any ideas how to encourage them to do any wider reading at home, I'd fully appreciate that. But I found that has worked really, really well.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, because reading the news is difficult because it's a different kind of text, and also particularly now in this sphere where we've got news that isn't always news and it isn't always fact, and it's and that adds an extra layer of complexity, and it feels like it should be our job to teach them, but as Andrew's pointed out, we've got so many demands on us. And to what extent do we sacrifice that over the curriculum, which we are actually, it is our job to teach the curriculum. Let's go to Sarah.
Hiya. Yeah, I was just kind of building on from what Nicola was saying, really, is the idea that actually I've got a large number of students that really range in ability and accessibility when it comes to their backgrounds. So I find it really useful to start them off by using one of our lessons a week, taking in a variety of different newspapers, so that they can really access from kind of the reading age of like the Sun and things like that, right up to the Telegraph and the Guardian, and looking at one key news story, but different students are looking at it from different perspectives. And then we can even go backwards a little bit further, because our school signs up to the week. I don't know if anyone else uses it from a P6G standpoint, but it really breaks it down, and it's mainly used in Key Stage 3. But that then, you pick a topic, you discuss that one topic, and it gets them used to kind of looking at newspapers and seeing the sorts of language that's going on, but also the sorts of different opinions that's happening as well. And we found that really useful, that we use right at the beginning, right up to Christmas, and then we kind of start looking at the higher level stuff. Yeah,
so I mean, I hadn't ever thought about really the week, because it does condense it. I think, Helen, you mentioned the Curious Economist, and you introduced me to that this week. It is incredible. Do you want to say anything about that, about how you use that? You just have to unmute yourself. There we go.
Am I just unmuted there? Right, I am Helen, I'm not Ian, and Peter said that I can change the settings, but I daren't, because it's...
Don't worry, we'll just call you Ian, it's fine.
Yeah, so the Curious Economist. Peter mentioned there's lots of educators on Twitter, and I very often, I use I have 2 Twitter accounts. I use one for me personally, interacting with other educators and my friends. I use others, a sort of a work one, for distributing links to my students and interacting with them. And what I'll do is I'll pick up an interesting story in one of the free papers like The Guardian or whatever. I'll link to it, and I'll maybe put a question in there saying, how can you link to PED on this business article, or I might hashtag the part of the spec. I'm using the old hashtags Econ 1, Econ 2, 3 and 4 and so on. But so I'll often ask like one little question there. And over the years, I have built up a number of articles that I've downloaded and put, you know, maybe 5 or 10 questions about it to help them read and understand. But the Curious Economist is kind of doing that for me, and it feels like it's cutting some of the news stories down to size, so it's more accessible. And they normally put maybe 3 questions on, so it's quite quick if you wanted to adapt those.
So I think one of the great things about that is that although it doesn't solve one of the problems that Andrew mentioned, that it doesn't solve the problem that, you know, it still takes time for us to teach that, and it still takes time away from the students. And it also, you know, teaching topicality stuff takes away from students, takes away from the narrative and the flow, and that's particularly important in economics, I think, is your sequencing and the order in which you build things up. However, it does make it very easy to search for topics, and it does take that time away from our end of having to prepare all that stuff, so that we can then focus on the kind of more pedagogical elements and then focus on our actual teaching. Something that I think would be particularly perhaps interesting if you are on Teams, or if you have a Moodle, don't think you can do it on Google Classroom, or if you have a Twitter, is that you can actually copy the RSS feed so that it will feed directly into your Teams, and you can choose how often it does it. You can choose whether it does it every 15 minutes or every 3 days, whatever, and it will post those stories directly to your team page. You can choose whether it's on, you know, the assignments page or the general page, whatever, and you can do the same on Moodle as well. So that could be a way to almost automate that. As I say, it doesn't solve all our problems, because it doesn't mean that we've still got to decide what we do in lessons and how we approach that, but it does at least take away some of the teacher time, so we can focus on some of that stuff. I'm just going to take the last one here. Who was it that had a scrapbook? Ben, can you just talk very quickly about your scrapbook? You don't have to if you don't want to, but
yeah, of course. Yeah, it's quite a simple idea, but the application side of things in both economics and business, we all know, is really important. So they're literally their first homework of the year is to buy a scrapbook, and I've always done a traditional art style scrapbook. That's what I've asked for. I think with the recent discussions on OneNote and the use of Teams, I think there's some great potential to use that more next year. So that might be something to investigate. But very, very simply, I sort of have to give them a lot of guidance at the start of the year, because they go off and find all sorts of articles that they're interested in, that obviously don't tie in perfectly with the course. So that you try and, I think, you know, to remove the scaffolding as you go through the year. But it's up to the pupils to bring in an economics or business article, and then it's sometimes it's sort of around the group discussion, sometimes it's bring a hot chocolate and coffee discussion, sometimes it's just driven with a few questions. But I give them quite a lot of instruction about how to analyze that article and put in their opinions early on as well. So it's not just I've printed an article off and I haven't really read it, here it is. They've got to introduce the article to the class, they've got to analyze, and one of my instructions is always they've got to leave the class with a question, so that the other pupils have to attempt to answer it. And that gets better and better as they go through the year, because the 2 years, I should say, because they then get, you know, what were you looking for, and they get sort of the greater links to the course as you go through. By the end of the course, what you tend to find, especially the best pupils, it's always the way, but they've got a really well annotated scrapbook with all sorts of articles. They've built up their application through the year, and then you see some of those links and that contextual analysis coming through in their answers, which is really, really, obviously really, really good to see, and builds up their application marks as well. I would be very interested to see how that works electronically next year, if that's what I end up doing, because there's the potential to use OneNote and technology and so on. So that's what we do. Quite simple. Obviously time is an issue, but we try and fit it in at least an article a week. Sometimes it's every other week if there's time constraints.
Okay, so that's kind of people bringing their own articles. I think what we've discussed how to make it easier, and we've discussed how to get kids engaging. I still think that you know, the questions that Andrew asked initially about the balance and when and how we do that is interesting. I mean, Nicola mentioned that she did a lot more in year 2 than year 1, which I know Andrew has said that he does as well. Can I just have just as a very quick show of hands, this is going to be very infantile, but if you teach if you discuss whatever news story comes up, regardless of where you are in the course, can have a thumbs up. And if you just teach it when it's relevant, so for example, if you're teaching PED, that you do a story on PD, can have thumbs down. And if you're somewhere in the middle, you can just give me a somewhere in the middle. I think it's just be interesting to see. So if you teach it whenever, you know, you'll take any news story, you only do it when it's relevant or somewhere in the middle. So lots of people in the middle, but some people on either side. And I think that's a really interesting one. I know that I'm probably a thumbs down. I probably teach when it's relevant, but that might be because I'm just not very good at doing and incorporating it. So that's it's an interesting one. I think it's a discussion that, you know, needs to continue really in economics, is what the best thing to do for students for learning is.